It started as an ordinary afternoon drive, the kind where the radio plays softly, the sun sits warm on the windshield, and nothing feels even slightly out of place. The man had just left work, thinking only about getting home and unwinding, when flashing red and blue lights appeared suddenly in his rearview mirror. He pulled over immediately, confused but compliant, replaying the last few minutes in his mind to make sure he hadn't unknowingly broken a traffic rule. The officer approached slowly, not with the casual confidence of someone handling a routine stop, but with an almost predatory focus, observing more than necessary, analyzing with unusual intent. His tone was slightly agitated from the beginning as he asked for the man's license and registration, and though his words were polite on the surface, there was a sharpness beneath them that made the man uneasy. He could tell something was off, something intangible but unmistakably wrong. The officer's eyes didn't linger on the documents he had asked for. They scanned the interior of the vehicle instead, moving from the passenger seat to the floorboards, then to the small storage compartments, as if he already expected to find something incriminating. The man tried to remain calm, reminding himself that cooperation was the safest path, but the officer's behavior only grew stranger. Instead of returning to his squad car with the documents, the officer stood by the window far longer than necessary, repeatedly adjusting his vest, touching the same front pocket in a way that felt deliberate. He asked questions that had nothing to do with the stop. Where the man worked, what time he left, whether he lived alone. The questions didn't flow like conversation. They came as if part of a rehearsed script designed to unsettle him. The man's heart beat faster as he sensed the officer wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for justification. His tone kept shifting, alternating between casual and confrontational, as if he were trying to manipulate the man into saying something he could use against him. Several times the officer glanced toward a small gap between the driver's seat and the center console, even though nothing was there. The man felt the tension rising in his throat as suspicion formed in his mind. The officer wasn't interested in what was in the car. He was preparing for what he intended to put there. When the officer asked him to step out of the vehicle, the man complied, but with a growing sense of dread. The way the officer circled the car felt choreographed, not investigative. He didn't look for tire wear, lights, or anything related to a real traffic violation. He lingered by the back door on the driver's side, shielding his movements from view. The man noticed this, noticed how the officer positioned himself strategically, how he angled his body to block the line of sight, how his hands slid into that same vest pocket again. Everything about the stop felt wrong, not because of anything the man had done, but because the officer seemed determined to find or create fault. There was no backup officer, no citation being written, and no explanation for why he had been pulled over in the first place. The man stood outside his vehicle, pulse racing, instinctively sensing his safety and his future were now in the hands of someone who did not care about truth or fairness. The longer the stop dragged on, the more the man's unease grew into genuine fear. He watched helplessly as the officer opened the back door without permission, mumbling something vague about conducting a quick check. The man knew his rights, but he also knew that challenging the officer could escalate things dangerously. He stood frozen, palms sweaty, watching the officer bend slightly, his shoulders moving in a way that didn't match the actions of someone simply inspecting a vehicle. It was subtle, quick, almost practiced. His right hand dipped into his vest pocket, lingered for a split second, and then disappeared beneath the back seat cushion. The motion was so smooth and quiet that someone not paying attention might have missed it entirely, but the man saw everything, and his blood turned cold. He felt his throat tighten as panic clawed at his chest. He hadn't put anything there, had never owned anything remotely illegal, and had never been in trouble with the law. Yet here he was, watching an officer plant something in his car as casually as someone dropping keys onto a table. He wanted to shout, to stop him, to demand answers, but fear held him in place. He knew that any sudden movement, any accusation, any attempt to intervene could be twisted against him in an instant. The officer straightened up and closed the door slowly, turning back toward the man with a look that carried smug certainty. It was the look of someone who believed he had complete control of the narrative. The officer rested his hand on his belt and tilted his head, studying the man as though waiting for him to break under pressure. The man's heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the officer speaking. He felt trapped between the truth he knew and the lie the officer had just constructed. He forced himself to breathe evenly, trying to maintain composure as the officer began asking pointed questions. "Are you sure there's nothing in the car I should know about? You haven't been transporting anything illegal? You understand lying to an officer is a crime, right?" Each question was designed to corner him, to create a narrative where the officer's soon-to-be discovery seemed legitimate. The man answered honestly, each time insisting he had nothing to hide, but he could see the officer barely listened. The trap had already been set. His mind raced, wondering how he could possibly prove what he had just witnessed. Words wouldn't stand against a uniform and a fabricated find. He imagined the headlines, the accusations, the devastation this could bring to his family and career. He felt powerless, furious, scared, yet beneath all that fear a spark of hope flickered. The officer didn't know about the hidden Dashcam installed just days before. He didn't know about the secondary recording system synced to the man's garage feed, which automatically backed up footage to cloud storage. The man remained still, giving no hint that anything had been captured. He had to stay calm. He had to survive the moment. Because for the first time since the stop began, he realized he might still have a way to save himself. Not through confrontation, but through evidence the officer didn't know existed. The officer took a slow step toward the car again, the kind of theatrical movement done when someone wants an audience to believe something dramatic is about to unfold. He pulled open the back door with a deliberate flourish, glancing sideways at the man as if inviting him to watch the performance. The man stood rigid, trying to keep his expression neutral, even though his heart hammered against his ribs. The officer bent down and placed his hand beneath the seat exactly where he had just slipped something moments earlier. His fingers paused for a few seconds, exaggerating the search like an actor dragging out a scene. Then he suddenly inhaled, loudly, sharply, as if he had stumbled upon something shocking. He straightened up with practiced intensity and held out an object the man had never seen in his life. It dangled from the officer's gloved fingers like the perfect piece of incriminating evidence. The man's stomach dropped as he stared at it, recognizing immediately what the officer was trying to frame him for. The officer's voice took on a tone of false triumph, dripping with manufactured authority as he announced that this item had been found exactly where suspicious behavior suggested it might be. He spoke loudly, as though recording some imaginary audience, narrating the discovery for effect. He twisted the object slightly in the sunlight, letting it catch the light, emphasizing the severity of the situation. Then he turned to the man and asked coldly, "Care to explain this?" The man shook his head in disbelief, barely able to form words. He felt a wave of panic rising, not a small spike of fear, but a deep, suffocating dread that filled his lungs and tightened his chest. He told the officer he had never seen the object before, his voice trembling despite trying to hold steady. But the officer only narrowed his eyes and tilted his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was the look of someone who believed the trap had sprung perfectly. He treated the man's denial as predictable, almost amusing, asking again and again if he was sure he didn't recognize the item. The officer continued searching the car, not because he expected to find anything else, but to build a narrative, one that framed the man as guilty from the moment the lights flashed behind him. He exaggerated his movements, rustling through compartments, sliding his hand under seats, opening the glove box with force. Each pause, each dramatic sigh, was meant to intimidate, to make the man second-guess himself, to make the situation feel increasingly hopeless. The man watched helplessly, feeling as though reality itself had been twisted, replaced by a version controlled entirely by the officer. When the officer finally stepped back, He held the object against his chest, speaking into his radio in clipped authoritative tones, claiming he had found contraband in a suspect's vehicle. Every word made the man's stomach churn. He wanted to shout the truth, that the officer had planted it, that the evidence meant nothing, that this was a trap, but he forced himself to stay silent, remembering the hidden dashcam recording everything from the dashboard, capturing the officer's earlier movements, the planting motion, the staged discovery. He hoped the angle was clear, hoped it had recorded every subtle detail, hoped it would save him. For now, all he could do was stand still and breathe slowly, waiting for the moment he could reveal the truth. When the officer returned from calling in the false report, his posture had completely changed. He stood taller, shoulders squared, projecting the confidence of someone who believed he had constructed an airtight case. His hand hovered near his cuffs, his tone shifting into one of impatient authority. He told the man to turn around, warning him that resisting arrest would only make things worse. The man's throat tightened as adrenaline surged through him. He raised his hands slowly, forcing himself to comply despite the injustice crushing him from every angle. His mind raced, struggling to balance fear with the fragile thread of hope he had left. The cameras. He tried to speak without sounding panicked, telling the officer calmly that this was all a misunderstanding, that the object wasn't his, that he had proof. But the officer cut him off sharply, barking that everyone says that when they're caught. He stepped closer, brandishing the handcuffs in a way that felt more like intimidation than procedure. The man could feel his knees tremble as the officer lectured him about consequences, claiming that lying would be added to the charges, insisting that cooperation was his only chance at leniency. The officer's voice dripped with arrogance as he spun a narrative of guilt, painting the man as someone who had obviously been transporting illegal items. He even attempted to fill in motives the man never had, suggesting imaginary scenarios meant to trap him into admitting something. Each accusation struck the man like a blow, because he knew he was moments away from being arrested for something he didn't do. The man swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe steadily. He reminded himself that panic would not help, anger would not help, argument would not help. Only patience and the hidden recordings could save him. With a trembling voice, he mentioned the dashcam, carefully choosing words that wouldn't provoke the officer. He said the stop was being recorded. He said everything happening was on video. For the first time since the stop began, the officer hesitated. It was slight, barely perceptible, but the man saw it, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The officer tightened his jaw and scoffed, trying to dismiss the comment with an air of mockery, but the man sensed something shifting. The officer asked what kind of camera he had, his tone lower, less confident. The man met his gaze and repeated that everything was being recorded, including the search. The officer bristled, gripping the cuffs more tightly, shifting his stance as though trying to regain dominance. But a seed of doubt had been planted. The man could see it. The officer glanced at the car once, then again, calculating possibilities, wondering what angles the camera might have caught, what details might be visible, what actions might already be stored in cloud backup. The man didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't show fear. He simply stood still, holding on to the only advantage he had left. Deep inside, despite the terror clawing at his chest, he felt a faint pulse of strength. The truth wasn't in his words, it was in the footage. And sooner or later, that footage would speak louder than anything the officer could say. The hidden dashcam quietly records the exact moment the officer plants the evidence. Unbeknownst to the officer, the dashcam mounted just behind the rearview mirror had activated the moment the patrol car's lights flashed behind the man. Its lens, small and easily overlooked, captured the entire stop with an unblinking neutrality that no human bias could influence. Every shift of the officer's weight, every reach toward his vest pocket, every moment he angled his body to conceal his movements was quietly documented in crisp, time-stamped footage. The officer had no idea that the device had an ultra-wide field of view, perfectly angled to catch him slipping the planted item under the seat. While the man stood outside the vehicle, trying desperately to remain calm, the camera continued recording without interruption, storing the footage onto internal memory and simultaneously backing it up to cloud storage. Inside the vehicle, the microphone picked up more than just the officer's actions. It recorded the faint rustle of fabric as he leaned in, the soft click of his glove brushing the seat, the subtle shift of his breathing when he committed the act. The lens caught the precise moment his hand entered the vest pocket, then disappeared beneath the cushion, his shoulders blocking only part of the movement, while the reflection on the window revealed everything. The officer's attempt to stage the discovery, his exaggerated gasp, his triumphant posture, all of it was preserved in unforgiving detail. The dashcam didn't blink, didn't hesitate, didn't decide what mattered. It simply captured truth. When the man reminded the officer that the recording existed, he wasn't bluffing. He knew the device was recording not just video but metadata, timestamps, GPS coordinates, audio logs, and frame-by-frame transitions that could be slowed, enhanced, or analyzed by any investigator. The camera had also captured the officer's unusual pauses, his shifting tone, the manipulative questions he asked to build his false narrative. Even the angle of the officer's wrist as he planted the item was visible. But the dashcam wasn't the only silent witness. The man had set it to sync with a backup cloud server in his garage, a system originally installed to monitor break-ins but now serving a purpose far greater than home security. The backup recordings were transmitted instantly, meaning that even if the officer tried to seize the device or destroy the footage, the files were already stored off-site, immune to tampering. The officer's fate was sealed the moment he reached beneath that seat. As the scene unfolded outside, the camera continued capturing every detail. The officer pacing, adjusting his vest nervously after hearing about the recording, glancing toward the car with growing tension. The man noticed these subtle changes but said nothing. He knew that the recorded evidence was stronger than any argument he could make. He didn't need to shout or protest. The truth was already preserved in digital clarity. When the officer stepped away to make another radio call, the dashcam recorded his frustration, his jaw clenched, his gestures stiffer, his voice edged with something he tried to hide. He was no longer in total control, and the camera captured the moment he realized it. The man stood silently, knowing the device behind the windshield held the difference between freedom and injustice. Each second recorded became a lifeline, a defense, a shield against the false charges forming around him. The camera had witnessed everything, the planting, the lies, the staged discovery, and it would soon reveal the truth with more accuracy than any spoken word could. What the officer didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have predicted, was that the man's car was also synced to a secondary recording system connected to the smart garage at his home. The system had been installed months earlier, originally intended to track when the garage door opened or closed, or when someone approached the driveway. But it had an additional feature. Whenever the vehicle's dash cam activated, the garage hub automatically created a mirrored backup of the footage. The officer had no idea that when he leaned into the man's car, a second set of eyes was recording him from a slightly different angle. The garage system used a combination of AI stabilization and enhanced contrast settings, allowing it to refine and sharpen footage even in inconsistent lighting. The moment the officer bent over the back seat, the garage backup captured the subtle shifting of his arm, the unmistakable motion of his hand dipping into the vest pocket, and the exact position his fingers took as he slid the planted item beneath the seat. Even the reflection of the patrol car's lights dancing across the window helped illuminate parts of the scene that the dashcam couldn't fully catch. As the officer continued staging his discovery, the backup angle recorded everything from a perspective slightly higher and slightly wider, offering an unobstructed view of the insertion motion. The cloud-based system organized the footage in real time, tagging it with time markers and labeling unusual movements detected inside the vehicle. The officer unknowingly triggered a manual interference alert, a feature designed to notify the homeowner when someone opened or manipulated the car interior. The man's phone buzzed faintly an hour later, long after the confrontation, but by then the evidence was already saved in multiple folders, protected by encryption and accessible only to him. The garage camera also caught the officer's posture when he exited the vehicle, the way he adjusted his vest as if hiding his guilt, the stiff set of his shoulders, the self-satisfied tilt of his head that only someone certain of victory would display. It recorded his pacing, his sudden irritation when he heard about the dashcam, and the exact moment fear flickered across his face. The man wouldn't know any of this until he reviewed the footage later, but even in that moment, standing helplessly on the side of the road, he sensed a shift. Something had changed in the officer's confidence, and the hidden camera had caught the transition frame by frame. The second recording didn't just capture the planting, it captured context. It showed how the officer framed his questions, how he moved around the car with forced suspicion, how he exaggerated his reactions for the supposed discovery. It showed the difference between a legitimate search and a staged performance. The footage documented reality from two synchronized angles, creating a narrative that no amount of manipulation could erase. And while the officer tightened his grip on the man's wrist and prepared to slap on the cuffs, unaware he was moments away from catastrophic exposure, the garage system quietly saved another copy of the file, this one uploaded to a secure cloud server with a timestamp and a motion analysis summary attached. What the officer believed was a closed trap was already falling apart. The truth was already documented, twice. The evidence he planted was nothing compared to the evidence being gathered against him. As fate would have it, the quiet street where the stop occurred had several homes equipped with doorbell cameras and driveway security systems. While the officer was busy staging his discovery inside the man's car, one of these cameras, mounted across the street on a neighbor's porch, was already recording the entire interaction. The angle wasn't perfect, but it showed enough. The officer blocking the door as he reached inside the vehicle, the subtle but unmistakable motion of slipping something beneath the seat, and the way he glanced around afterward to make sure no one was watching. Another neighbor's camera picked up audio from across the yard, capturing the officer's exaggerated gasp during his staged find, followed by his triumphant tone as he announced the discovery. People walking their dogs paused and watched from a distance, noticing how long the stop was taking and how strangely the officer was behaving. Though they didn't intervene at the time, their cameras continued recording steadily, each clip adding another piece to the puzzle. When the man later began explaining what had happened, neighbors quietly offered their footage, surprised and disturbed by what they saw. The multiple angles created a full picture of the event, one that revealed not a guilty driver but an officer orchestrating a scene. The combination of the dashcam, the garage system backup, and now the neighborhood cameras formed a wall of truth the officer never expected, each lens capturing a different part of the lie he built with confidence and cruelty. The moment the man repeated that there were recordings, plural, the officer's confidence cracked. He tried to hide it, but the tension rippled through his posture. His grip on the handcuffs loosened for a moment before he clenched them again, forcing his expression back into something resembling authority. But the man saw the flicker of fear, the quick dart of the officer's eyes toward the car, then toward the street, scanning the area as if suddenly aware that he might not be alone in controlling the narrative. He asked sharply what the man meant by recordings, but the man simply stated with steady clarity that everything had been captured from more than one angle. The officer swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he processed the implications. Multiple recordings meant multiple witnesses. Multiple witnesses meant no way to twist the story. He stepped back, reconsidering the arrest he had been moments from carrying out, now visibly torn between doubling down or retreating. His voice, once dripping with false confidence, wavered as he tried to reassert control with threats and warnings. But the man no longer needed to argue. The truth had already cornered the officer. The knowledge that his every movement might already be backed up, watched and shareable, made the officer's breathing grow shallow, his facade cracking as the realization set in that the trap he'd built may soon snap shut on him instead. When additional officers arrived on the scene, they expected a routine assist. Nothing unusual, just another suspect detained on the roadside. But as soon as they stepped out of their vehicles, they noticed the tension hanging thick in the air. The first officer pacing, stiff and restless. The man standing unnaturally calm for someone supposedly caught with incriminating evidence. One of the backup officers approached and asked what was going on, and the first officer repeated his rehearsed lines with forced confidence, describing the discovery he had made. But his voice lacked its earlier swagger, trembling slightly at the edges. The man didn't interrupt. He simply stood with his palms open, repeating softly that everything was recorded. This time, he added that there were multiple recordings, including footage already backed up to a secure cloud system. One of the arriving officers frowned at that detail, glancing at the man's car, then at the first officer, sensing the strange energy between them. As they watched, damning energy began to spill over. More of the thing that had come down. Backup officers were trained to pick up on inconsistencies, and something about the first officer's explanation didn't match the man's steady, unwavering insistence. The air shifted again when a neighbor cautiously approached from the sidewalk, holding a phone and explaining she had footage as well. The backup officers exchanged looks, their expressions tightening as doubt crept into their professional instinct. None of them made accusations yet, but the first officer stiffened visibly, realizing the story he had constructed was no longer under his control. The arrival of backup, instead of strengthening his position, exposed the cracks forming beneath his version of events. Cracks widened by every mention of recordings, witnesses, and angles he couldn't manipulate. As the backup officers began asking questions, the first officer's desperation became more obvious. He insisted loudly that the man was lying, that suspects always invent stories about cameras when they panic, and that he had followed procedure perfectly. But the words spilled out too quickly, too defensively, as if he were trying to outrun the truth. One of the officers asked him directly whether he had conducted a proper search and whether he had permission to enter the vehicle. His answers wavered, full of half-finished explanations and incomplete justifications. The man simply repeated that the dashcam had captured every second of the officer's movements, including the moment he planted the item, and that the footage was already stored off-site. The first officer's face paled slightly, his attempts at authority dissolving into visible panic. He tried shifting the blame, accusing the man of being manipulative, claiming the camera angle might be deceptive, even suggesting the footage was probably edited. But the backup officers weren't convinced. They had seen genuine fear, genuine confusion, genuine guilt before, and the man standing calmly before them showed none of it. What they did see, however, was the unmistakable tension radiating from their fellow officer, the kind that came not from handling a dangerous suspect, but from a person realizing he was caught in his own lie. His explanations grew weaker, his gestures more frantic, and every word he spoke only tangled the narrative further. The truth was no longer something he could suppress with authority or intimidation. It was already unfolding in front of multiple witnesses, and the story he had tried so hard to control was slipping through his fingers with every second that passed. When the backup officers realized that the situation had grown far beyond the simple narrative their colleague had attempted to present, they made the decision to de-escalate everything on scene. One of them stepped closer to the man and spoke calmly, asking if he was willing to show the footage he mentioned. The man nodded, keeping his voice steady as he explained that the recordings were automatically saved to a secure cloud drive and could be accessed from his phone. The first officer's reaction was immediate and telling. His shoulders tightened, his stance shifted backward, and, for the first time, true fear flickered across his face. He stepped forward as if to object, but one of the backup officers raised a hand, signaling him to stay back. The authority he once wielded so confidently was dissolving slowly, not with dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, undeniable shift in credibility. The man tapped his phone, logging into the app connected to his Dashcam system, and the backup officers leaned in with focused expressions. They watched as a clear, wide-angle view appeared on the screen, showing the first officer leaning into the car, repositioning himself, glancing around, and slipping something from his vest pocket beneath the seat. None of them spoke at first. The silence grew heavier with every second that played, each frame peeling back another layer of the officer's deception. The man handed the phone gently to one of the officers, who reviewed the footage again, slower this time, eyes narrowing as he examined the exact moment the item was planted. The first officer tried to step forward, insisting there must be a misunderstanding, that the angle was deceptive, that the suspect must have tampered with the footage, but his voice cracked under the weight of his unraveling authority. One of the backup officers asked him to remain still, their tone firm, signaling that the investigation was no longer under his control. The man then offered to show the second camera angle from the garage system, explaining that the footage should have automatically uploaded. The backup officers looked at one another with an expression of grim resolve. They understood they now needed to verify everything. As the man opened the garage app, the second angle appeared, offering an even clearer view of the transaction. The moment the officer lifted the seat, the exact placement of the item, the exaggerated sigh he performed for dramatic effect, the shift of his posture as he stepped back to stage his discovery. The backup officers no longer appeared confused or cautious. They looked disappointed, frustrated, and increasingly certain of what had really happened. One officer stepped to the side and requested a supervisor over the radio, his tone clipped with urgency. The first officer realized then that his version of events was collapsing entirely, and he tried again to protest, stumbling over explanations that grew less coherent with each attempt. He insisted the man had put the item there earlier, that he had followed protocol, that he was being framed. But his colleagues were now watching him differently, more analytically, more critically, more skeptically. They asked him why he had opened the vehicle without requesting permission. They asked why he hadn't followed standard reporting procedure. They asked why his body language during the search appeared inconsistent with legitimate protocol. He couldn't answer cleanly because the truth stood in silent contrast to every lie he tried to build. When the supervisor arrived, he immediately sensed the tension. The backup officers briefed him quietly, showing him the footage, explaining the inconsistencies, the planting motion, the fabricated discovery. The supervisor's expression hardened as he watched the video, realizing that the actions unfolding on screen were not mistakes, but deliberate misconduct. He asked the first officer to step aside for a private conversation, but the man watched from where he stood, knowing that the conversation was not one he would be allowed to shape. The supervisor returned and approached the man with professionalism, apologizing for the distress he had endured and explaining that the situation would be handled through internal review. The first officer was instructed to surrender his weapon temporarily, a procedure that struck him visibly, removing the last symbolic token of his control. He hesitated, but the supervisor repeated the order, firmer this time, and the officer complied with trembling hands. The supervisor then asked the man to email the footage to Internal Affairs, ensuring a documented chain of evidence. The man complied willingly, still shaken but grateful that the truth was finally being acknowledged. As the supervisors and backup officers coordinated the next steps, the first officer stood on the roadside in a daze, realizing that his career, his authority, and his reputation were slipping away with every passing second. The review process had begun, and this time, there was no way for him to manipulate the narrative. His expression shifted from arrogance to panic, to a hollow resignation as he understood that what he had attempted to bury under the seat was now becoming the very thing that exposed him completely. The aftermath of the incident unfolded over several days, but the pace of truth moved faster than the officer could have imagined. The Internal Affairs Division reviewed the footage carefully, comparing timestamps, analyzing angles, and interviewing the responding officers who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand. They reviewed the man's statements, the digital backups, and the neighborhood camera footage that neighbors willingly provided once they learned what had happened. The version of events was clear. Every file, every frame, every witness collectively painted an airtight picture not of a guilty man, but of a law enforcement officer who had betrayed his duty by fabricating a crime. The man received a call confirming that all charges were dropped before they were even processed, and he was invited to give a full statement for the official investigation. He spoke calmly, providing details about the stop, the officer's suspicious behavior, the fear he felt, and the moment he realized the officer was planting evidence. News of the incident began spreading through the neighborhood, first by word of mouth, then through local community forums. People who had seen the commotion that day now understood the gravity of what had happened. Neighbors reached out to the man with messages of support, expressing relief that he had been cleared and offering their camera footage to ensure justice was served. Some admitted they had previously felt uneasy during encounters with the same officer but had never known how to speak up. The incident revealed a pattern that had gone unnoticed or unreported, and the community began rallying behind the man, grateful that his recordings had brought the truth to light. The man, who had once felt completely powerless during the stop, now found his voice strengthened by the support of those around him. Meanwhile, the officer's situation deteriorated quickly. The internal investigation exposed not only the misconduct from that day, but also inconsistencies in several previous reports he had filed. Supervisors questioned his documentation practices, his search procedures, and his decision-making during stops. The department placed him on administrative leave, pending formal disciplinary action. Rumors circulated among officers that the evidence was so overwhelming that termination was likely, and prosecution was not off the table. The officer's attempts to salvage his reputation grew weaker with each inquiry he faced. His colleagues, who once trusted him, now distanced themselves, unwilling to link their careers to someone who had abused his authority so blatantly. The man received another call inviting him to a community policing meeting, where officials publicly acknowledged what had happened and assured residents that reforms were underway. They promised increased training on accountability, transparency, and proper search procedures. The man attended quietly, not seeking attention, but wanting to ensure the truth was heard. After the meeting, several strangers approached him, thanking him for speaking up and for having the presence of mind to install cameras. Parents expressed relief, saying they felt safer knowing someone had exposed a problem that could have threatened others. The man realized that his recordings had done more than protect him. They had protected future victims of the officer's misconduct. The garage system footage became a central part of the community conversation. People asked him what kind of cameras he used, how to install similar systems, and what features they should consider. The man answered patiently, explaining how the backup feature had saved him. For many residents, it was the first time they realized how valuable evidence could be in situations where truth and authority collided. A few days later, the man received a letter from the department formally clearing him of all allegations and apologizing for the distress he had suffered. Though the apology could never erase the fear he felt during the stop, it marked an acknowledgement he never expected to receive. The officer, on the other hand, faced a very different conclusion. The investigation confirmed that he had planted evidence. His actions violated multiple policies, ethical codes, and legal statutes. The department moved to terminate him, and discussions began about referring the case to prosecutors. He had tried to destroy someone's life for reasons no one could understand: arrogance, frustration, prejudice, or simply the abuse of unchecked authority. But now, everything he attempted to fabricate had returned to destroy his career. The man finally returned to his normal routine, driving the same route he had taken on the day of the incident, but feeling a different sense of awareness. He no longer viewed his cameras as mere safety tools. They were guardians of truth. Neighbors waved at him more warmly, recognizing the quiet strength he had shown throughout the ordeal. His story traveled through online platforms shared by people who saw it not just as a moment of injustice, but as a reminder of how technology could empower the innocent. And though he never sought the spotlight, his experience became an example for others. Evidence speaks louder than fear, and truth once recorded cannot be erased by lies. If this story kept you watching, made your heart race, or opened your eyes for even a moment, then don't leave without joining this community. Hit that like button to push stories like this into the spotlight where they belong. Subscribe so you never miss the next real case we break down, and turn on notifications so you're here the second the next twist drops. Your support helps these stories reach more people who need to see the truth get uncovered. And I want to hear from you. Tell me what part shocked you the most, what you would have done in this situation, or if you've witnessed something similar. Your comments shape the next videos, and your voice matters more than you think. And don't scroll away just yet. Your next story is already waiting. Click the video on your screen now and dive into another moment just like this. Because once you start seeing the truth, you can't unsee it.